I think the president was very clear and direct in his truth, John, but just to reiterate, the fact that Canada will control what crosses the Gordie Howe Bridge and owns the land on both sides is unacceptable to the president. It's also unacceptable that more of this bridge isn't being built with more American-made materials, even more so than what President Barack Obama committed to with the Canadians at the time, at the start of the project. He also believes that the U.S. should own at least half of the bridge, have shared authority over what passes across it, and participate in the economic benefits generated by its use. This is just another example of President Trump putting America's interests first.
You wake up, check your phone, and suddenly a bridge that is almost finished is being treated like it can be stopped overnight. Not because the engineering failed, not because the money ran out, not because the project was illegal, but because Donald Trump decided to target it. And the question almost sounds unreal. How does a bridge negotiated more than a decade ago, approved by both sides, financed upfront by Canada, and designed to support one of the busiest trade corridors in North America, suddenly become a hostage in a trade dispute? That was the headline. But what happened next changed the story completely. Because instead of exposing a Canadian takeover, Trump's threat exposed something else. A deal Michigan had already agreed to. A bridge the United States had already approved. A project Trump himself had previously endorsed, and a private bridge monopoly that suddenly had every reason to fear competition. That is when this stopped being just a bridge story. It became a story about infrastructure, leverage, private power, public money, and who controls the physical routes of North American trade. So let's break this down carefully. Because the headline sounded like power, but the structure underneath told a very different story. The bridge at the center of this fight is the Gordie Howe International Bridge, connecting Windsor and Detroit. The project is commonly described in Canadian terms as about $6.4 billion, or roughly use $4.7 billion, and it is intended to create a new high-capacity crossing in one of the most important Canada-US trade corridors. Reuters reported that Trump threatened to bar the bridge from opening and demanded talks with Ottawa, while objecting to Canada's role in funding and control of the project. On the surface, that sounds like a dispute over fairness. But once you look at the record, the claim starts to weaken. Because yes, Canada financed the project up front. That part is true. But Canada financing the bridge is not the same thing as Canada stealing the bridge. It is not the same thing as excluding Michigan. And it is not the same thing as cutting the United States out of the benefits. The Canada-Michigan Crossing Agreement was signed in 2012, creating the framework for Canada and Michigan's roles in the project. AP reported that the bridge is jointly owned with Michigan, and that Canada funded the construction with plans to recover costs through toll revenue over time. That is the first thing that changed after Trump targeted the bridge. The documents came back into the story. And documents are hard to shout down. Because under the structure that had been publicly known for years, Michigan was not left outside the project. Michigan was part of it. Michigan gets a major new trade asset. Michigan gets long-term economic benefit. And Michigan did not have to pay the upfront construction cost. That is not exclusion. That is a negotiated arrangement. And here is where the story becomes even more revealing. This was not a new arrangement that suddenly appeared in 2026. In 2017, Trump and Justin Trudeau issued a joint statement saying they looked forward to the expeditious completion of the Gordie Howe International Bridge, calling it a vital economic link between the two countries. So the bridge did not suddenly change. The ownership structure did not suddenly change. Canada's financing role did not suddenly change. The economic purpose did not suddenly change. What changed was the political environment. By the time Trump targeted the bridge, U.S.-Canada relations were already under pressure from tariffs, dairy disputes, restrictions involving U.S. alcohol, and Canada's wider trade discussions with China. Reuters reported that Trump cited several of those issues when threatening to bar the bridge from opening. That is how infrastructure becomes dangerous in a trade fight. A bridge stops being treated as a bridge. It becomes leverage. A crossing stops being treated as shared economic machinery. It becomes a pressure point. And when that happens, the question changes. The question is no longer, does this bridge improve trade? The question becomes, who can use it? Who can delay it? Who can turn it into a bargaining chip? And that is exactly why what happened next matters. Because Canada did not respond with panic. Carney did not turn the bridge into a shouting match. Reuters reported that Carney said the issue would be settled after speaking with Trump, and emphasized that the bridge is jointly owned by Michigan and Canada, with Canada financing construction and recovering costs through toll revenues over time. That response was important, not because it was loud, because it was structured. Carney's strongest weapon in that moment was not outrage. It was the agreement, the ownership structure, the financing model, the historical record, the fact that the United States had already approved the project. That is what quietly changed the story. Trump's claim needed the public to see the bridge as a one-sided Canadian advantage. The record showed something else. It showed a binational project, a Michigan asset, a Canada-financed crossing, a shared trade corridor, a project designed to reduce congestion, create redundancy, and help both sides. So the question stopped being, why is Canada controlling America's bridge? And became, why is a jointly beneficial, previously approved, Canada-funded, Michigan-backed project suddenly being framed as if America was cheated? That is a much more dangerous question for the threat itself. And Michigan understood that immediately. AP reported that Michigan officials and lawmakers pushed back against Trump's threat, warning that blocking the bridge would damage trade, jobs, and economic activity on the U.S. side as well. That was the second thing that changed everything. Michigan pushed back. Because this was never a clean Canada versus America story. The Detroit-Windsor corridor is deeply integrated. Auto parts cross back and forth. Manufacturing schedules depend on border timing. Suppliers, workers, truckers, and companies are connected across the river. A bridge delay does not stop neatly at the Canadian side of the border. It travels. It moves into Michigan. It moves into factories. It moves into supply chains. It moves into worker paychecks. It moves into consumer prices. That is the part political language often hides. A threat aimed at Canada can still hit Americans first. And that is why this bridge matters so much. The Gordie Howe Bridge was designed to add redundancy to a corridor that has long depended heavily on the Ambassador Bridge. It is also designed with highway-to-highway connections and major inspection infrastructure to improve movement across the border. The official project materials describe 24 primary inspection lanes in Canada, 36 in the United States, and separated commercial and passenger lanes. That is not just construction detail. That is the economic function of the bridge. The bridge exists because the old system was too dependent on one dominant crossing. And when one crossing controls too much of a trade route, it becomes a vulnerability. That vulnerability has a name: the Ambassador Bridge. For decades, the privately owned Ambassador Bridge dominated heavy commercial traffic between Detroit and Windsor. The nearby tunnel does not handle heavy truck traffic in the same way, meaning the Ambassador Bridge became the critical route for commercial movement in the corridor. Axios reported that Democrats were investigating whether Matthew Maroon, whose family owns the Ambassador Bridge, had used access to Trump to protect toll revenues from the competing Gordie Howe Bridge. That was the third thing that changed everything. The private monopoly question exploded. Because when Trump threatened the new public bridge, people did not only ask whether Canada was being targeted, they started asking who benefits if the new bridge is delayed. Who benefits if competition is stopped? Who benefits if the old crossing keeps its dominance a little longer? Those are not small questions. They go to the heart of the entire bridge fight. Because the Gordie Howe Bridge is not only about connecting two cities, it is also about breaking overdependence on one old route. It is about giving North American trade a second high-capacity option. It is about making sure one privately owned crossing does not remain the only practical heavy truck artery in one of the continent's most important manufacturing corridors. So when a new public competitor is nearly ready to open, and then the president threatens it, scrutiny is inevitable. Democrats on the House Oversight Committee demanded records after reports that Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick met with Matthew Maroon on the same day Trump threatened the bridge. The committee sought communications involving Maroon, the Commerce Department, and the Trump administration. Now, that does not prove every answer, but it absolutely changes the question. Because now the issue is not only, did Trump target Canada's bridge? The issue becomes, was a public infrastructure project being threatened in a way that could protect a private competitor? That is much bigger. And that is why the title question matters. Did what happened next change everything? Yes, because the threat did not just create a dispute. It exposed the power structure underneath the dispute. It exposed the documents. It exposed Michigan's stake. It exposed the private interest question. And it exposed how fragile cross-border infrastructure can become when politics enters the system. Now let's talk about the cost. Because this is not symbolic. A delay has a price. Bridge Michigan reported that an Anderson Economic Group analysis estimated delays could cost up to $7 million per week, including lost operating revenue and costs tied to customs and plaza operations. $7 million per week. Not because the bridge collapsed. Not because the project failed. Not because demand disappeared. But because politics introduced uncertainty into a project designed to reduce uncertainty. That is the irony. The bridge was built to make the corridor more reliable. The threat made reliability political. And once reliability becomes political, companies start recalculating risk. That is where this story becomes bigger than the Gordie Howe Bridge. Because what Canada saw here was not just one threat. Canada saw a pattern. A project can be negotiated, approved, financed, nearly completed, supported by previous U.S. statements, structured to benefit Michigan, and still be thrown into uncertainty because the political mood in Washington changes. That is a major lesson. Because if a bridge can become leverage, then so can a tariff exemption. So can a port. So can a supply chain. So can an energy route. So can an auto rule. So can any piece of the physical economy that connects Canada to the United States. And that is why what happened next matters so much. Canada did not only defend a bridge. Canada learned again why redundancy matters. The Gordie Howe Bridge itself is a redundancy project. It creates another route, another crossing, another way for trade to move. And that same logic is now showing up in Canada's broader economic strategy. When one route becomes too exposed, you build another one. When one crossing becomes too vulnerable, you add redundancy. When one partner becomes unpredictable, you diversify. That is not anti-American. That is risk management. And it is exactly what serious countries do when the old comfort zone becomes unstable. For decades, Canada's economy was built around one dominant route, the United States. Close, huge, integrated, familiar. But importance is not the same as safety. The Ambassador Bridge was important. That did not mean the corridor was resilient enough. The U.S. market is important. That does not mean Canada can afford to remain exposed to every political shock that comes from Washington. That is the deeper Tradeconomics lesson. This bridge fight is a physical version of Canada's wider economic challenge. Canada needs access to the United States, but Canada also needs backup. Canada needs trade with the United States, but Canada also needs options. Canada needs the corridor. But Canada cannot afford a corridor that can be turned into a weapon every time trade politics gets ugly. So what changed after Trump targeted Canada's $6.4 billion bridge? The bridge did not suddenly become complete. The ownership structure did not suddenly change. The trade corridor did not suddenly detach from politics. But the public understanding changed. The facts came out. Michigan pushed back. Congress started asking questions. The Ambassador Bridge's private interest angle entered the frame. And the Gordie Howe Bridge stopped looking like just another infrastructure project. It started looking like a test of whether agreements still matter, a test of whether shared infrastructure can survive political pressure, a test of whether a new public crossing can challenge an old private dominance, and a test of whether Canada can keep relying on one route, one partner, and one political mood across the border. That is why this moment matters. Because sometimes a threat does not win. Sometimes a threat exposes the system. And once the system is exposed, the politics change. So here is the real Tradeconomics take. Trump targeted Canada's $6.4 billion bridge and tried to frame it as a bad deal for America. But what happened next exposed something very different. The bridge was not a Canadian takeover. It was a long-negotiated, jointly owned, Canada-financed trade project that Michigan stands to benefit from and that both economies need. The threat did not just challenge Canada. It challenged the credibility of agreements. It challenged the stability of cross-border infrastructure. And it raised uncomfortable questions about who benefits when a public bridge that competes with a private monopoly is suddenly placed under political pressure. That is why this story is bigger than steel and concrete. It is about trust. It is about leverage. It is about who controls the physical routes of trade. And it is about what happens when infrastructure becomes part of a political power game. Because if a bridge built to create redundancy can itself become a bargaining chip, then Canada's lesson is clear. Do not depend on one route. Do not depend on one crossing. Do not depend on one political mood. Build options. Because in today's North American trade environment, options are not a luxury. They are survival. So here's the question that matters most. Was Trump really fighting for fairness on the Gordie Howe Bridge? Or did his threat accidentally reveal exactly why Canada needs more redundancy, more diversification, and less dependence on any single route controlled by politics? If this breakdown helped you understand what is really happening beneath the headlines, share the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. At Tradeconomics, we follow the markets first, then expose the power mechanics underneath. Because the real story is never just the bridge, never just the tariff, and never just the headline. It is who pays, who benefits, who gains leverage, and what the system reveals when pressure is applied. See you in the next one.